The eggs were still warm when the last ship left. Dariofeld knew this because he had checked them 20 minutes before the evacuation alarm went off, and dragonkin eggs did not cool quickly. They held heat the way stone held sunlight, slowly absorbed, slowly released. He had spent 4 years studying them. He knew their temperature curves better than he knew his own resting heart rate. He also knew that if they were loaded onto an emergency shuttle during a Level 7 solar flare evacuation, shoved into cargo racks built for equipment crates, subjected to the full vibration load of emergency thrust, every single one of them would crack before the ship cleared the moon's gravity well. He had run the numbers twice. He had been running them in his head again when he heard the shuttle bay doors seal. The outpost was called Caldera, which was a human name for a volcanic crater, which was fitting because the entire moon it sat on was geologically unstable and had been slowly trying to kill everyone stationed there for the better part of a decade. It was not a comfortable posting. The walls sweated mineral water. The air recyclers made a sound like a man clearing his throat every 40 seconds. The nearest resupply ship came once every 3 months if the routes were clear. Dario had asked to be stationed there. He had submitted the request 4 times before it was approved. The Kael'drath egg clutch was the only known clutch outside of their home system. The Kael'drath were not a species that trusted easily. The fact that they had allowed a human researcher access to the nursery wing at all was the result of 11 years of careful diplomacy and 2 separate interspecies accords. Dario had read every document in that chain. He understood, better than most, what the eggs represented. He understood it even better now, standing alone in the nursery wing while the flare alarms screamed and the outpost shook with the distant rumble of departing ships. There were 6 eggs. They sat in their thermal cradles, each one roughly the size of a large watermelon, each one a deep reddish-brown with faint iridescent streaks that shifted color when the light caught them at the right angle. Kael'drath eggs were not fragile in the way that bird eggs were fragile. They were tough, leathery, resilient to most things, but they were acutely sensitive to sudden pressure change and high-frequency vibration during the final stage of development. These 6 were in that final stage. Had been for 2 weeks. The cradles they sat in were anchored to the outpost's geothermal grid. The grid ran off the moon's own volcanic heat. It did not need the outpost's main power systems to function. It would keep running even if everything else went dark. Dario set his evacuation bag down on the floor. He sat down next to it. He stayed there for a while, listening to the alarms cycle down one by one as the last ships got clear of the exclusion zone. When it was quiet, he got up, walked to the main monitoring panel, and began running system checks. The flare hit the outpost 6 hours later. It was not as bad as the projections had suggested. The communications array went down first, then the external sensors. The upper habitat ring lost pressure and sealed itself off automatically. The geothermal grid held. The nursery wing held. Dario had already moved his sleeping bag and his food supply and his medical kit into the corridor adjacent to the nursery, which was the most structurally reinforced section of the outpost. He had also moved the backup power cells, the emergency water reclamation unit, and the small toolkit he used for maintenance work. He was not optimistic, he was practical. There was a difference. 3 days after the flare, he began transmitting on all available frequencies. The communications array was damaged but not destroyed. He had rerouted power to the relay antenna on the outpost's eastern face, the one that had been sheltered from the worst of the flare. The signal was weak and fragmented, and he was not certain anyone was receiving it. He transmitted anyway. His first message was simple: outpost status, his name, confirmation that he was alive and operational. His second message included the status of the eggs. Far away on a Galactic Union orbital station positioned above neutral space, a communications officer named Bree flagged an incoming signal from the Caldera system as anomalous. She ran it through the decryption suite twice because the fragments were badly distorted. What came through was partial and incomplete, but enough of it was legible to cause a problem. A human was inside the abandoned outpost. The Kael'drath egg clutch, which should have been destroyed in the flare, appeared to still be present. Bree forwarded the intercept to her supervisor, who forwarded it to the Union duty officer, who escalated it to the diplomatic desk within the hour. By the time the Kael'drath colony ship received the news relay, Wren had already formed his conclusion. He did not share it quietly. He stood in the main hall of the colony ship and said it in front of 40 witnesses. The human had stayed behind to take the eggs. Humanity could not be trusted. The words moved fast through the colony ship, then faster through the relay networks, then faster still, the way accusations always moved faster than the truths they preceded. Sora heard it from 3 different sources before she had finished her morning meal. She did not say anything to any of them. She sat and thought about the nursery wing. She thought about the geothermal grid. She thought about the numbers she knew because she was an elder and elders knew things like incubation tolerances and vibration thresholds. She thought about a human xenobiologist who had asked, twice, in formal writing, whether emergency evacuation protocols included provisions for clutch transport during final stage development. She had not answered that request. There had been no time. She set down her food and looked out the viewport at the stars. The final log fragment that came through the relay that evening was 3 words, scratched out of noise and static by the Union's best signal recovery software. Day 3, alive. Below it, barely legible, 4 more words. All 6, still warm. Sora read the fragment once. Then she folded her hands and closed her eyes and did not speak for a very long time. The accusation did not arrive at the Union Council chambers quietly. It arrived the way a stone arrives when thrown through a window, fast, loud, and followed by a long silence in which everyone looked at the damage and tried to decide who was responsible. Wren's formal declaration reached the diplomatic desk on the same day as the signal fragment. The Union processed them in the wrong order, which meant that for approximately 6 hours, the official record showed only the accusation. The context came second. By then, the context no longer mattered to most of the people who had already read the accusation. Admiral Voss received the summons to the Union Council chambers 40 minutes after she finished her shift debrief. She read it standing in the corridor outside the operations center, still holding a cup of cold coffee, and she said nothing for long enough that the ensign who had handed her the document asked if she was all right. She said she was fine. She was not fine. She knew Dario felt the way commanding officers knew long-term field researchers, not personally, not well, but well enough to have a sense of the shape of him. He had filed quarterly reports that were always on time and always twice as long as required. He had once submitted a formal request to delay his annual rotation by 6 weeks because he was in the middle of a data collection cycle and did not want to hand off incomplete work. He had been denied and had complied without complaint, but his handoff notes to the replacement researcher had been so thorough that the replacement had sent Voss a message saying it was the best documentation they had ever received. He was not the kind of man who stole things. She was reasonably certain of this. She was less certain that the council would share her assessment. The chambers were large and deliberately neutral in their design. No species architectural preferences were favored, which in practice meant the space satisfied no one and vaguely unsettled everyone. Voss took her seat at the human delegation table and folded her hands and waited. Councillor Shah opened the session without ceremony. She was a Union delegate from a species that valued directness, and she extended that value to procedural matters. She summarized the situation in 4 sentences. 1 human researcher remained on an evacuated outpost in a post-flare zone. The Kael'drath egg clutch had not been confirmed destroyed. Fragmentary transmissions suggested the researcher and clutch were in the same location, and the Kael'drath community had formally requested an explanation. Then she looked at Voss and waited. Voss said she did not have an explanation. She said this without apology, because apologizing for things she did not do struck her as a poor habit to start. She said she intended to retrieve her researcher and that the retrieval would produce answers. She requested authorization to dispatch a ship. She was denied. The Union had already authorized a retrieval. The ship would be crewed by Kael'drath personnel. Ren would lead it. The decision had been made before Voss was summoned, which told her everything she needed to know about how seriously the Union was taking Ren's declaration. She did not argue. She asked one question: would there be a Union observer on the retrieval ship? Counselor Ashar said that Sora, the Kael'drath elder, had requested to accompany the crew in an observational capacity, and that this had been accepted as equivalent to Union oversight. Voss looked at Ashar for a moment, then she nodded and said nothing else. The session continued without her needing to speak again. Other delegates raised concerns. A species called the Drevathi asked whether the eggs could be used for biological research without the Kael'drath's consent, and what human research ethics policies said about that. Voss did not respond to this. She wrote the question down so she could be angry about it properly later, in private. Ren spoke twice during the session. The first time he gave his formal statement, he had witnessed the evacuation departure from the colony ship. The humans' absence from the manifest had not been flagged as a rescue situation. It had been flagged, initially, as an administrative error. No search had been conducted. The signal fragment, combined with the egg clutch's continued presence, suggested a deliberate decision to remain. The second time Ren spoke was when a delegate asked whether there was any scenario in which the humans' actions could be considered something other than theft. Ren said he could not think of one. In the gallery above the chamber floor, Sora sat and listened and said nothing. The gallery was not part of the formal session. She was not required to speak. She watched Ren below her and thought about the particular quality of his certainty, how clean it was, how uncomplicated. She remembered when she had been capable of that kind of certainty. She was not sure whether she missed it. She had not shared her theory with anyone. She had reasons for this. The first was that a theory from an elder who wanted her eggs to be safe would be interpreted as wishful thinking, not analysis. The second was that she needed to see the outpost herself before she offered anyone hope she could not prove. Hope was not a kindness if it was wrong. She had learned this a long time ago. The session ended. Ren's retrieval ship was scheduled to depart in 18 hours. Voss returned to her quarters and sat at her desk and went through everything she had on Dario Feld. His file, his reports, his research notes. She read for 3 hours. At the end of 3 hours, she was more certain than before that he had not stolen the eggs. She was also no closer to knowing what had actually happened, because the signal fragments were not enough, and the outpost's communication systems were badly damaged, and the full picture was somewhere inside a building on a geologically unstable moon that she was not permitted to visit. She was not a patient person by nature. She had learned patience the way most military officers learned it, through repeated confrontations with situations she could not resolve by moving faster. She applied it now. Then, late into the night cycle, a new fragment came through the relay. This one was longer, still distorted, still partial, but longer. It was a log entry. The date stamp was corrupted, but the content was not. Voss read it twice. Dario had not been trying to transmit a message. He had been recording his daily log, and the damaged relay had been broadcasting it automatically. He had not known anyone was listening. He had been talking to himself. In the methodical way he apparently did everything, documenting what he had done that day and what he planned to do the following day, and whether the numbers still looked manageable. Near the end of the fragment, he said something that Voss read 3 times and then sat down on her desk and looked at the wall for a while. He said, "I do not know if anyone is receiving this. I am transmitting on all frequencies because I was taught to do that and because it is the correct procedure and because it gives me something useful to do in the evenings when the hatchery is stable. If anyone is receiving this, I want them to know the situation here is under control. If no one is receiving this, then I am talking to a wall, which is fine. I have talked to walls before. They are acceptable company." Then day 11, geothermal grid is holding. Coolant pressure in nursery wing is down 4%, but within acceptable range. I have rerouted secondary power to compensate. Then quieter, I made a promise to this world. I intend to keep it." Voss sat with that for a while. Then she got up and began preparing her case for when the retrieval ship brought him back. The first thing he did after the last ship left was count his food. Not because he was panicking. He was not panicking. He counted because he needed a number, and numbers had always been easier to work with than feelings. The feelings could come later. The math had to come first. He had 11 days of standard rations in his personal kit. Another 9 days' worth in the outpost's emergency locker, which had not been fully cleared because the evacuation had been fast, and the locker was in a back corridor that people tended to forget. He found 4 additional protein blocks behind a shelf in the equipment room. He added those to the count. 24 days, maybe 26 if he was careful. He needed to be alive long enough for a rescue ship to reach him, or for the flare activity to drop enough that he could transmit a clear enough signal to give someone his coordinates. Based on the flare projections he had read before the array went down, the worst activity would pass in 8 to 10 days. A ship dispatched from the nearest Union waypoint would take another 12 to 14. He needed to last 22 to 24 days. He had 24 to 26 days of food. This was, he wrote in his log that first evening, not a comfortable margin, but it was a margin. He intended to treat it as sufficient. He did not write about the choice he had made, not that first night. The choice felt too large to put into words yet, and he did not trust himself to describe it accurately while it was still so close. He would write about it later, he decided, when he could see it clearly. Right now he needed to focus on the things he could measure. The nursery wing was the most important system to keep stable. The Kaeldrath eggs required a consistent temperature of between 38 and 42 degrees and a humidity level of no less than 60%. The geothermal grid could manage the temperature automatically as long as it had power and the coolant lines remained intact. Humidity was harder. He checked the wing's moisture regulation unit and found that one of its 3 cycling pumps had failed sometime in the last month, a fault that had been reported and not yet repaired. He fixed it himself, using a spare part from the maintenance closet. It took 4 hours. While he worked, he talked, not to anyone in particular. He had done this his whole life, talking through problems aloud when he was working alone. His colleagues had found it odd. He had never cared. It helped him think. He said the pump housing is corroded on the lower seam, which means this is not a new fault, which means whoever logged it knew what they were looking at. He said, the replacement part fits, but I will need to reseal the housing or the pressure reading will be inaccurate. He said, if the humidity drops below 55 in here, I will have a larger problem than I currently have. He resealed the housing. The humidity reading stabilized. He called this a success. The flare hit on day 6. He had expected day 4 or 5 based on the projections, which suggested the projections had been conservative. He was in the internal corridor when it hit, away from any exterior walls, with his emergency kit and his data tablet and a container of water. He listened to the outpost complain around him, metal expanding under heat, seals compressing, the low structural groan that buildings made when weather pressed against them hard enough. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing he could not live with. He stayed in the corridor for 16 hours until the sensors told him the worst had passed. Then he walked the outpost section by section and catalogued the damage. The communications array on the west face was gone. The external sensor network was mostly offline. The upper habitat ring had depressurized and sealed. The main power generator had dropped to 40% capacity. The geothermal grid was intact. The nursery wing was intact. He wrote all of this down. He then wrote, because he believed in complete records, the outpost is survivable. I am not comfortable, but I am not in immediate danger, proceeding with standard maintenance protocol. He spent the next 3 days repairing what he could and routing power away from systems he did not need. He shut down the upper habitat ring entirely and redirected its power allocation to the nursery. He shut down 2 of the 3 water recyclers and maintained only the one closest to the nursery corridor. He ate less than his calculated daily allowance on days 7 through 10 and did not record this in his log because it was a minor detail and minor details cluttered the record. On day 11, he found the relay antenna on the eastern face, which was intact and which he had overlooked during his initial damage assessment because it was small and painted the same color as the wall. He rerouted power to it and began transmitting. He did not know if the signal was reaching anyone. He transmitted anyway. His logs from this period were careful and detailed and almost entirely practical. He wrote about the nursery systems. He wrote about his repair work. He wrote about the calculations he ran each day to estimate how much longer he needed the grid to hold, how much longer the coolant lines would manage, how much closer the eggs were to hatching. He had been tracking their development cycles since he arrived on Caldera. He knew the timeline. They were close. He also wrote once about the choice. He wrote, "I want to be accurate about what happened on evacuation day. I was in the nursery wing. I heard the alarm. I ran the numbers on clutch transport in my head while I was standing there, and the numbers did not work, and I already knew they did not work because I had asked about them formally, twice, in writing, and never received an answer. The eggs would not survive emergency extraction. That was a fact. The geothermal grid would survive a level 7 flare. That was also a fact. I had the skills to maintain the nursery manually. That was also a fact." He paused there, then he wrote, "I do not think I made a heroic decision. I think I did arithmetic. The answer to the arithmetic was that I should stay, so I stayed." On day 31, the nursery went quiet in a different way. He had learned over the weeks to read the room's silences. There was the silence of stable systems, which was regular and faintly humming. There was the silence of a pressure drop, which was slightly flatter. And there was the silence he had not heard before and recognized immediately because he had read about it in every piece of Kael'drath developmental literature he could access. It was the silence of an egg doing something from the inside. He pulled up his stool and sat in front of the cradles and did not move for the next 4 hours. At the end of 4 hours, a crack appeared in the shell of the second egg from the left. The crack widened. A small, dark, scaled snout appeared. Then a head, much too large for the crack, pushing through anyway with the absolute confidence of something that did not know what giving up meant. The hatchling fell into the cradle. It was smaller than the reference images he had studied. Its scales were still dark and damp. It shook its head once, twice, cleared its eyes, and looked around the room. Its gaze moved across the ceiling, across the far wall, across the monitoring equipment, and stopped on Dario. It looked at him for a long time. He looked back. He had a great deal of scientific training and almost no experience with this particular feeling. He wrote about it later, choosing his words carefully. He wrote, "It looked at me the way living things sometimes look at whatever is present when they arrive in the world. I do not want to assign significance to this that it does not have. But I found it," he crossed that out and started again. "But it was significant to me personally, whatever it means biologically." Over the next 3 days, the remaining 5 eggs hatched. He was there for all of it. Ren had expected many things when the retrieval ship cleared the debris field around Caldera and the outpost came into sensor range. He had expected signs of forced entry into secured storage. He had expected scrambled access logs. He had expected the specific disorder that came from someone working quickly in a place they should not be, taking things that did not belong to them. He had investigated resource violations before. He knew what they looked like. He had not expected the outpost to be running on 51% power, with every non-essential system shut down, and the full load of the remaining capacity routed to a single wing on the southern face. He had not expected the nursery wing to be the warmest point on the entire structure. He stood at the sensor display for a long time and did not say anything. Behind him, his team prepared their boarding kit. They were professionals. They did not need to be told twice about anything. He was grateful for that because right now he was not entirely sure he could give clear instructions. The reading did not make sense for what he had assumed. A researcher stealing eggs for study would not need to keep them warm. Eggs taken for exploitation would be in transit, not sitting in their original cradles. The power allocation was not the pattern of someone who had taken something. It was the pattern of someone who was maintaining something. He made himself set this observation aside. It was too early to revise his conclusion based on sensor readings alone. He had stated his conclusion publicly, formally, before witnesses. He needed more than a warmth signature before he reconsidered. Sora said nothing from her seat at the rear of the bridge. She had been very quiet since they left the Union station. She watched the sensor display from where she was sitting. He could not read her face. Aboard the Union orbital station, thousands of light-minutes away, Admiral Voss had not slept. She had been working through the log fragments as they came in, feeding them to the signal recovery team and waiting for each new piece. The fragments were arriving more frequently now. The relay antenna Dario had repaired was getting stronger signal the further the flare activity receded. Each new fragment was a little cleaner than the last. She had a picture now, not complete but enough. She had pieced together the evacuation morning. She had pieced together the food count, the flare damage, the power rerouting, the pump repair that had taken 4 hours. She had a fragment from day 16 in which Dario described, in the dry, careful way he described everything, the process of cleaning the nursery floor, because Kael'drath hatchlings in the developmental literature were described as sensitive to environmental contaminants, and he did not know how close they were to hatching, and he preferred to err toward preparation. She had a fragment from day 22 in which he noted that his food supply was lower than projected, because he had been underestimating his caloric needs due to the physical labor of the maintenance work, and that he had adjusted his daily intake downward to compensate, and that this was fine, and that he wanted the record to reflect that he considered it a minor logistical issue and not a crisis. She had a fragment from day 31 in which a very controlled, very precise scientific voice cracked slightly and he said, "The second one hatched this morning. I was there. It is very small. I am well. Everything is within expected parameters." Voss read that fragment 4 times. Then she read the ones that came after. Day 32, day 33, 6 hatchlings, all alive, all eating from the emergency nutrient stores that had been left in the nursery wing. Dario was sleeping in 4-hour rotations to keep watch. His logs were getting shorter because he had less time, but he kept writing them. On day 38, he had written, "They have started following me. This is, apparently, normal for young Kael'drath in the imprinting phase. I want to note for the record that I am aware I am not their parent. I want to note also that they do not appear to share this awareness, and that I have decided this is a problem I will address when there are professionals available to assist. Because I do not have the training for it, and I do not want to do it wrong." On day 39, the smallest one has started sleeping on my foot. I have not moved it because the reference literature says disrupting the imprinting phase without a trained handler present can cause lasting behavioral issues. I am choosing to believe this and not examine it too closely. Voss was still reading when the log fragments stopped being fragments. The relay antenna had been getting stronger. On day 41, which the timestamp showed was today, Dario had transmitted a full log entry, uninterrupted, clear. It was 12 minutes long. He went through the nursery systems. He went through the power readings. He noted that 2 of the hatchlings had started making sounds that matched the early vocalization patterns in the Kael'drath developmental literature, and that he found this encouraging. He noted that his food supply was approaching its limit, but that the retrieval window he had estimated was also approaching, and he expected them to overlap. Then he said, in the same tone he said everything, "I have been transmitting these logs for 30 days. I do not know what has happened outside this outpost. I do not know what was assumed about why I stayed. I imagine some assumptions were made. I want the record to be clear about the sequence of events." He stated the sequence, exactly, clearly, numbers, facts, timeline, reasoning. He did not frame it as a defense. He framed it as a data log. At the end, he said, "I made a decision based on available information and available skills. I would like, when someone reaches me, to be able to explain it properly. I would like the explanation to be heard before any conclusions are finalized. That is all I am asking." Voss stood up. She walked into the council chamber where the session had been ongoing for 4 hours, and she did something she had not done since her first year as an officer. She interrupted. She said, "I need the chamber to listen to something." She plugged her data tablet into the room's audio system. She did not ask for permission. She pressed play. The chamber listened to 12 minutes of Dario Feld's voice. When it ended, the room was very quiet. Counselor Asha looked at the table in front of her and was still for a moment. Then she looked up and asked if the retrieval ship had reached the outpost yet. Voss checked her communication unit. The retrieval ship had docked at Caldera 14 minutes ago. In the gallery above, Sora had already known. She had received Ren's docking confirmation on a private channel. She sat with her hands folded and her eyes closed and let herself feel, for the first time since the evacuation, something other than dread. On the orbital station, in the quiet after the 12 minutes of voice, nobody spoke for a long time. Then a delegate Voss did not know well, a small, four-armed species from the outer rim who had said almost nothing in any session she had attended, said in a very quiet voice. He counted the food first. Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. The airlock opened onto a corridor that smelled like mineral water and warm stone and something else, something alive and animal and new, underneath everything else, faint but present. Ren noticed it before he noticed anything else. He had grown up in the nursery halls of the home system. He knew that smell. He had not expected to know it here. His team moved in standard formation. He was at the front. The corridor lights were on but dim, running on the reduced power allocation he had seen on the sensors. The walls were slightly damp. The floor was clean. That was the second thing he noticed. The floor was clean, not the kind of clean that came from automated systems, the kind that came from a person with a brush. The nursery wing was at the southern end of the outpost. He knew its layout from the facility schematics. They moved through 2 intersecting corridors and a sealed pressure door that opened automatically when the team approached, because Dario had apparently unlocked the internal doors at some point and had not resecured them. That was the kind of detail that struck Ren as strange. Someone with something to hide would have locked the doors. He filed this observation without acting on it. The nursery wing's outer door was open. He stopped at the threshold. The room was not large. It held 6 thermal cradles in a curved row along the far wall. 5 of them were occupied. The 6th cradle was empty. The monitoring equipment along the side wall was running, screens showing temperature, humidity, power load, all within normal range, all reading green. The room was warm. After the cooler corridors, the warmth was immediate and physical, like stepping from shade into sun. Dario Feld was sitting on a low stool in the middle of the room. He was not sitting alertly, the way a person sat when they were waiting to be found. He was sitting the way a person sat when they had been awake for too long and had forgotten to make it look like they were fine. His clothes were clean but worn. There was a data tablet on his knee. He had apparently been writing in it when the door opened, and he looked up with the mildly startled expression of someone interrupted in the middle of a sentence. Around him and partly on him were 6 young Kaeldrath. Ren had seen hatchlings before. He had seen them in the nurseries at home, in their first weeks, small and dark-scaled and slightly ungainly, moving in the instinct-driven way of things that had not yet learned how they worked. He recognized the developmental stage. He recognized the size. He recognized the way they moved. He did not recognize, immediately, the way they were positioned. 4 of them were near Dario, 1 at his feet, 1 pressed against his left side, 2 behind him. The 5th was exploring the base of the monitoring equipment with its nose. The 6th, the smallest, was on Dario's lap, asleep. Ren stood in the doorway and said nothing. His team behind him was also saying nothing. He heard one of them shift their weight. That was all. Dario looked at Ren. He looked at the team behind him. He looked at Ren again. Then he carefully moved the sleeping hatchling from his lap into the empty cradle, which Ren understood now was his, not a 6th egg's. Dario had given the hatchling his own sleeping space at some point and was no longer using it. He stood up and set the data tablet down and said, in a voice that was steady but that had the faint texture of very controlled exhaustion, "They are all healthy." I have documentation of the entire period. I can walk you through it. He stepped to the side of the room. He gestured toward the hatchlings. He said, "They are yours. I kept them warm, that was all." Ren could not move. He had come in prepared for a confrontation. He had rehearsed it, not consciously, but in the way the mind rehearsed things when it was certain of what it would find. He had a certainty, and the certainty had a shape, and the shape had no room in it for this, for a tired man stepping aside, for 6 healthy hatchlings in a clean room, for the smell of life in a building that should have been empty. Behind him, one of his warriors made a sound, not a word, just a sound. Zora pushed past him. She moved through the team the way water moved, without asking, without hesitating, finding the spaces between people and passing through them. She was old and she moved like it, but she moved without stopping. She crossed the nursery floor and stood in front of the hatchlings and was still. The hatchlings looked at her. The 4 near Dario shifted. 2 of them pressed closer to him. One of them moved towards Sora and stopped halfway. The smallest one, in the cradle, woke up and looked around and then looked at Dario and made a sound. Dario looked at it. He did not go to it. Ren noticed this. He stayed where he was, at the side of the room, and he watched Sora, and his expression was the expression of a man who understood what needed to happen and was very carefully not getting in the way of it. Sora crouched down, which was not easy for her, and which she did without any sign that it cost her anything. She spoke in the old tongue. Ren had not heard the old tongue spoken in the nursery cadence since he was very young, since his own earliest memories, and the sound of it in this room, in this broken outpost on this dying moon, hit him somewhere behind the sternum. The hatchlings listened. The one that had stopped halfway came the rest of the way. 2 of the ones near Dario looked at each other and then at Sora and then moved toward her slowly. The remaining 2 stayed near Dario. Sora kept speaking, patient, steady, not commanding, inviting. One more came. That left one, the smallest, in the cradle. It had been watching all of this with the focused attention of something very young that was trying very hard to understand. It looked at Sora. It looked at Dario. It looked at Sora again. Dario turned to it. He crouched down to the level of the cradle and he spoke, not in any language Ren recognized, just low, quiet sounds, the kind a person made when they were speaking to something that could not understand words but could understand tone. Whatever he said it for a while. The hatchling listened. Then it climbed out of the cradle slowly and crossed the floor and pressed its head against Sora's hand. The room was very quiet. Ren realized his hands were not in the correct position for confrontation. He looked down at them. At some point, he had lowered his arms entirely. He did not remember deciding to do that. One of his warriors said, quietly, not to anyone in particular, "What did you say to it?" Dario straightened up. He considered the question. He said, "I told it the truth, that she was its family, that I was just someone who was here." Ren looked at this man, at the worn clothes and the clean floor, and the data tablet full of documentation that nobody had asked him to keep, and the 6 hatchlings that were alive and healthy, and had clearly been fed and watched over and spoken to for 41 days by someone who had done the arithmetic and decided to stay. He looked at him for a long time. He had been very certain. He had stated his certainty publicly. He was going to have to think carefully about what certainty was worth when it was this wrong. Sora straightened up as well. She looked at Dario across the length of the nursery room. She said his name, not as a question. She had been told his name in the briefing documents, but she said it again now differently, the way a name changed when it was attached to something real instead of something on a page. She said, "I am Sora, I am their elder." He said, "I know, I read your research on the 2nd stage developmental period. I used it." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "I would like to see your documentation." He picked up the data tablet and brought it to her. Ren watched this and felt, underneath all the complicated things he was feeling, a specific and uncomfortable clarity beginning to form. It was the clarity that came just before an apology, in the moment when a person finally stopped arguing with what was in front of them and started figuring out how to live with having been wrong. He was not there yet, but he could see it from where he was standing. The tribunal verdict took less time to reverse than it had taken to reach. Councillor Shah read the formal reversal in 4 sentences: all charges withdrawn, full clearance issued, Union diplomatic record amended, human delegations standing restored pending review of circumstances. She read it in the same even voice she read everything, which was, Voss thought, probably the correct approach. There was no good way to perform a reversal without either overcorrecting into ceremony or undercorrecting into dismissal. Shah split the difference by treating it like weather, a condition that had changed, noted for the record, moving on. The debate that followed was not brief. It lasted 3 months. Not the formal tribunal that was done, but the question that came after the tribunal, the one nobody had written an agenda item for, turned out to be the question that mattered most. Every species in the Union's membership wanted to answer it, and they all had different answers, and none of them were entirely wrong, and none of them were entirely right, which was perhaps the most human outcome possible for a question that was fundamentally about a human. The question was, why did he do it? The Caeldrath Elder Council, after considerable internal deliberation, issued a formal statement that said humans were closer to their animal instincts than they appeared, and that what Dario had demonstrated was a kind of territorial protective response triggered by proximity to young. This was offered as an explanation and also as a mild compliment, which was how the Caeldrath tended to give compliments, wrapped in something that sounded clinical so that neither party had to feel exposed by the warmth of it. Union diplomatic analysts published a report suggesting that Dario's actions were likely motivated by an implicit understanding of the political capital his survival with the eggs would generate for humanity. The report was 40 pages long and included 17 footnotes and cited 6 precedents from human diplomatic history. Admiral Voss read the whole thing and wrote a single note in the margin at the end. He was tracking coolant pressure. She did not submit this note formally. She did not need to. 17 academic papers appeared in the following 6 months. Voss read summaries of all of them. 2 were interesting. The rest were the kind of papers that were written to be published rather than to be true. Dario gave one interview. A Union media correspondent came to him on his next posting, a wetland research station on a temperate world 3 systems out from Caldera, and sat down with him on a log near the water and asked him why he had stayed. He thought about it for a moment. He said, "The eggs were alive, I had the equipment, I had the skills, the geothermal grid was intact, these were the conditions, I matched what I had to what the situation required." The correspondent asked if he had been afraid. He said yes, initially, when he ran the food numbers, but the numbers had worked out, so the fear had been manageable. The correspondent asked if he would do it again. He said yes, obviously. The correspondent said, even knowing what it cost you, the lost months, the diplomatic crisis, the accusations. Dario paused here. He looked at the water. He said slowly that he was not entirely sure what it had cost him. He had lost some weight. He had used up a significant portion of his maintenance toolkit. He had spent 41 days alone on a damaged outpost, which had been difficult, but also, in certain respects, very quiet, and he had gotten a great deal of log writing done. He said he was still trying to identify the loss that other people kept referencing, and he was open to being told what it was. The correspondent said, "Your reputation, your standing, months of your life, an accusation that went across the entire galaxy." Dario considered this. He said, "The accusation was based on incomplete information. Once the information was complete, the accusation went away. That seems like how it is supposed to work." The correspondent waited, clearly expecting more. Dario said, "I do not think I lost my reputation. I think people found out what I did and then formed opinions about it. That is different from losing something. That is just people learning a fact." The interview was published. It was read by a very large number of people across a very large number of worlds. The response to it was complicated and loud and lasted several weeks. Voss read most of the commentary and found it mostly beside the point, but she also found it, in its own way, moving, because the reason so many people could not stop talking about it was that none of them had a clean framework for what Dario had done. And when a species or a person or a community lacks a clean framework for something, they tend to keep circling it, trying to find the angle from which it makes simple sense. It did not make simple sense. That was the point. It made human sense, which was a different thing, and the galaxy was still learning the difference. Ren sent Dario a message 8 months after Caldera. It was not long. He said that the 6 hatchlings were healthy and developing well and were already beginning language acquisition, which was ahead of schedule for their age group. He said one of them, the second smallest, had a habit of collecting small objects from around the nursery floor and arranging them in patterns, which the developmental staff found interesting. He said he had named one of the nursery wing corridors after the section of Caldera's outpost where the eggs had been kept. He said this was the traditional Kael'drath practice for acknowledging a place of significance. He sent the official naming record as an attachment. He did not name anything after Dario. He thought about it. He chose not to, for reasons he did not explain in the message and that Dario did not ask about. Dario sent back a 2-sentence reply thanking him for the update and saying he was glad the hatchlings were doing well. He printed the naming record and put it in a frame on his wall. He did not tell anyone it was there. His colleagues assumed it was a research citation. Sora arranged the rest. It took her 2 years and 4 formal petitions to the Kael'drath Elder Council and 1 very long conversation with the Union's Interspecies Education Board, but she arranged it. The smallest hatchling, the one that had been last to cross the nursery floor, the one that had slept on Dario's foot, the one that had needed to be told the truth before it could move, enrolled at the age of 2 years in the joint research program at Caldera's rebuilt outpost, which had been refurbished and reopened because it turned out that a building where 6 Kael'drath had been born was now considered a place of considerable significance, and nobody wanted to let it fall apart. The hatchling's assigned mentor was Dario Feld. Nobody was surprised by this. Nobody said it was inevitable, because that would have been sentimental, and the galaxy generally tried to avoid sentimental framings in official documentation. But nobody was surprised. Dario's equipment bag, which he had carried since before Caldera, had a small mark on the strap that had not been there when the bag was new. It had appeared one morning after the hatchlings were taken to the colony ship, burned into the leather in the faint, careful way that young Kael'drath sometimes marked things they considered important. He had looked it up. It translated, roughly, as he stayed. He kept the bag. He used it on every assignment. He never mentioned the mark unless someone asked about it, and when they asked, he said it was a notation from a research posting. And if they asked which posting, he would say Caldera, and if they knew the name, their expression would change in a way that he found slightly embarrassing and also, if he was being accurate in his documentation, quietly meaningful. He was a precise man. He believed in accurate records. The record at Caldera was this: 6 eggs, 1 man, 41 days, 0 losses. He considered this a satisfactory outcome. The galaxy considered it something else entirely. Both of them were right.